Chapter 1: A Threat from the Sky. Lisa Clark was enjoying a warm spring day in Riverside Park, Oregon. Sunlight filtered through the tree canopies, and a light breeze pleasantly refreshed her skin. She was pushing a stroller with her 6-month-old daughter, Sarah, who was peacefully dancing, wrapped in a pink blanket. Around them, voices of other parents could be heard, and children were laughing and playing on the playground. At that moment, nothing seemed amiss. Lisa stopped at a bench under a sprawling oak, adjusted the stroller's hood, and took out her phone to snap a few pictures of her daughter. Suddenly, she noticed a strange shadow glide across the ground. Then another one, and another. Looking up, Lisa saw several large birds circling above the park. Their wings were enormous, black feathers gleaming in the sunlight, and their beaks long and sharp. She thought they might be hawks or kites, but soon realized there were too many of them. Usually, such birds don't gather in flocks. The next moment, a piercing scream echoed through the air. Lisa jumped and looked around in the playground. A group of parents stood, all gazing upward. Then, a man shouted, "They're attacking!" Chapter 2: The First Attack. The flock began to descend rapidly. Lisa heard someone scream behind her, followed by the cry of a child. She turned around and saw one of the birds, a massive black hawk, grab a boy by the hood of his jacket and try to lift him into the air. The child's father lunged forward and knocked the bird off its course. The predator quickly loosened its claws and flew upward, but instead of leaving, it circled higher, scanning for another target. Lisa felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She instinctively grabbed the stroller, but at that moment, she heard the flap of wings. Something heavy slammed into her shoulder, pushing her aside. As she fell, she saw the bird's claw clutching the edge of the blanket where Sarah lay. Lisa's heart began pounding wildly. Without thinking, she sprang to her feet and grabbed the stroller, pulling it toward herself. The bird screeched and jerked upward, but Lisa didn't let go. A real battle had begun. The park was filled with screams. Several other birds swooped down on people, attacking them, trying to grab children and even bags of food. In a panic, parents grabbed their babies, shielding them with their bodies, while some, summoning courage, waved their jackets and bags to scare off the predators. Lisa felt her strength waning. The bird was pulling the stroller upward, but she clung to it with all her might, trying to keep it on the ground. Seconds felt like eternity, but suddenly, a loud thud sounded. Someone had thrown a water bottle at the bird. The hawk flinched, loosening its grip, and Lisa seized the moment to yank the stroller toward herself. The bird screeched and soared into the air, circling above them, searching for a new target. Lisa grabbed Sarah and pressed her to her chest, trembling all over. This was just the beginning. Chapter 3: Prisoners of the Park. The crowd of parents was in a frenzy. Some tried to hide under pavilions. Others ran for the exit. But the birds, seemingly realizing that their prey was trying to escape, became more aggressive. They swooped down, targeting children and bags, diving at terrifying speed, ripping items from people's hands. Lisa held Sarah tightly and looked around for cover. A group of parents had huddled under a wooden gazebo a few meters away, and near the playground was a small cafe. Should she run there or stay? But before she could make a decision, a massive hawk dove down again. Its wings slashed through the air with a deafening snap. Lisa darted sideways, positioning herself between the bird and the stroller. The bird's claws scraped her sleeve, leaving long rips in the fabric. The pain made Lisa cry out, but she didn't let go of her daughter. Chapter 4: The Siege Continues. People rushed toward the cafe. Inside, tense silence prevailed. The barista nervously wiped his brow. "They're not leaving," muttered an elderly woman by the window. Lisa held Sarah, her heart pounding wildly. Outside, the birds circled there, landing on roofs and benches, as though guarding their territory. "We can't stay here," said a tall man. "This glass won't stop them." The barista nodded. "We have a back exit. It leads to the parking lot." At that moment, a loud crash echoed. The birds began slamming into the glass windows, scratching at the doors with their claws. Lisa clutched Sarah tighter. One of the windows cracked, spider webbing with fractures. Chapter 5. The Escape. "Run!" yelled the barista, opening the back door. People rushed toward it. One of the windows shattered, and a mass of wings and claws poured inside. Lisa gritted her teeth and ran. Holding on to Sarah, someone behind her fell. A man defended himself with a tray. They burst into a narrow alley. The parking lot was ahead, but the birds were already diving down into the cars. Someone screamed. Lisa sprinted toward a van. Several people were already getting in. The door slammed shut, and the birds collided with the metal. The engine roared to life, and the van sped away. Chapter 6. Salvation. The van raced down the street, leaving the chaos behind. Ahead, police with rifles appeared. "We're here," shouted the driver, honking the horn. The police lined up, opening fire into the air. The birds finally began retreating, scattering in all directions. The people in the van exhaled in relief. Lisa held Sarah tightly. She was safe, but one question echoed in her mind. What if this happens again? Chapter 1. The Attack. It was an ordinary Saturday afternoon when Melissa decided to take her son, Caden, to the park. The sun was high in the sky, and the air was warm, with a slight breeze rustling the trees. They were both in a relaxed mood, looking forward to the quiet afternoon ahead. Melissa was pushing Peyton in his stroller, the wheels making soft squeaks as they moved over the paved path. Peyton, a 6-year-old with curious eyes, was talking excitedly about the new toys he had seen in the store earlier that day. His small voice echoed happily through the park, blending with the distant sound of children playing and the occasional chirp of birds in the trees. Melissa smiled, enjoying these peaceful moments, the kind she cherished the most. But as they reached the edge of the park, something shifted in the air. The calm and peace were suddenly replaced by an unsettling stillness. Melissa frowned as shadow passed overhead, and she instinctively looked up. At first, it seemed like a regular bird, soaring high above, but then something caught her eye. Another shadow, then another, and then an unmistakable presence of something much larger than any bird she had ever seen. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw them down scenes of them. Huge, dark shapes circling above. Her thoughts raced, but before she could react, one of the creatures swooped down. The air was thick with the sound of wings flapping. Melissa's instincts kicked in just as one of the birds, a massive predator, perhaps an eagle or a hawk, lunged toward Peyton, its talons gleaming in the sunlight. Melissa screamed and grabbed her son, pulling him away, but the bird was too fast. It caught him by the leg, dragging him toward the sky. The force of the bird's grip made Peyton cry out in pain. Melissa's heart raced as she tried to hold onto her son, but she wasn't strong enough. The bird had him. The situation was happening so fast that Melissa's mind couldn't process it properly. She had no idea what to do. Panic overtook her as she tried to wrestle Peyton free from the talons. But the bird was relentless. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the bird released its grip, dropping Peyton back onto the ground. Melissa fell to her knees beside him, pulling him into her arms. But the terror wasn't over. The birds weren't done. More of them were circling above, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Melissa's breath came in short gasps, her hands trembling as she checked on Peyton. His leg was bleeding from the talon marks, and his face was pale with shock. "Mama, what's happening?" he whispered, looking up at her with wide, terrified eyes. Melissa didn't know how to answer him. She didn't understand it herself. She had heard about bird attacks before, but never like this. There were stories of large birds attacking small animals, but never anything like this. Never this aggressive. Her mind raced. She couldn't just stand there. The park was crowded with people, yet no one seemed to notice the growing danger. Melissa glanced around and saw that others were still oblivious to the deadly creatures circling in the sky above. That's when she noticed something else. A larger bird had broken away from the flock. It was heading straight for them. Chapter 2. The Escape. Melissa's heart pounded in her chest as she pulled Peyton into her arms. The larger bird was getting closer. Its wings spread wide as it descended rapidly. Its eyes glinted with a predatory focus, and Melissa could feel the blood draining from her face. She didn't have time to think. There was no time for hesitation. "Mama, please, I'm scared," Peyton cried, clinging to her tightly. The sound of the bird's wings, growing louder, filled Melissa's ears. Her pulse raced as she realized she had to act fast. There was no way she could outrun the bird, and running wasn't an option with Peyton in her arms. Her only choice was to protect him, shield him from whatever danger was coming. Without thinking, Melissa dropped to the ground, pulling Peyton down with her. She covered his body with her own, hoping that the weight of her would be enough to shield him. The bird's sharp talons scraped the air above them, missing them by inches. Melissa's breath came in shallow gasps, her mind swimming with thoughts of how much danger they were in. The park was eerily silent, except for the sound of their ragged breaths and the distant cries of children, who had no idea what was happening. "Stay down, Peyton. Stay quiet," Melissa whispered urgently, trying to keep calm. She looked up just in time to see the bird retract its claws. Not satisfied with the failed attempt, it was circling, waiting for its moment to strike again. Panic clawed at Melissa's chest, but she knew she couldn't afford to lose focus. Suddenly, she heard the sound of sirens. A distant echo at first, but the noise grew louder, closer. Her heart leapt in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, help was on the way. The bird circled above, unwilling to give up, but it seemed to sense the incoming danger. For a moment, it hesitated. That hesitation was all Melissa needed. She grabbed Peyton and began to crawl away, dragging him along the ground, desperate to get to safety. The bird, realizing that something had changed, broke off its attack and retreated. Melissa didn't stop to watch it fly away. She just kept crawling, pulling Peyton behind her, until they reached the edge of the park. By that time, the sirens had grown deafening, and she could see the flashing lights of an emergency vehicle pulling up to the entrance. Chapter 3. The Aftermath. A few hours later, after Melissa and Peyton were rushed to the local hospital, she still couldn't process what had happened. Sitting in the sterile hospital room, she tried to calm herself and her son, but every movement, every glance seemed like a reminder that they were no longer in the same world. Everything felt surreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Peyton sat next to her on the hospital bed. His eyes were dull with exhaustion, and there were traces of tears on his cheeks. He whispered quietly, trying to keep his emotions in check, but his face betrayed the deep fear that he couldn't hide. "Mom, why did they attack?" he asked, clinging to her side. His voice trembled, and Melissa could feel her heart breaking. "I don't know, Peyton, I don't know," she replied, trying to swallow the tears that kept falling. It wasn't just the physical pain from the scratch on her arm. It was the overwhelming feeling of helplessness that filled her chest, the feeling that she couldn't protect her child, that they had been so close to being taken by those birds. They spent several hours at the hospital as the medical staff tended to Melissa's injury and checked on Peyton for any possible trauma. Thankfully, he had no physical injuries beyond a few minor cuts and scrapes, but the psychological scars were much deeper. Melissa knew it wouldn't be the same after today. The terror in his eyes was something she'd never forget, and she was afraid it would stay with him for a long time. The doctor who examined her told Melissa that the scratches from the bird's talons weren't too severe, but she would need a course of antibiotics to prevent infection. He advised her to rest and take care of herself, but Melissa was too distracted by everything to hear him. She just wanted to get out of the hospital and make sure Peyton was okay. After receiving the necessary medical care, Melissa and Peyton left the hospital and returned home. It was their first night in safety after the terrifying ordeal, but the fear lingered. It was like a weight in the air, a constant reminder that something monstrous had just happened to them. Every noise, every shadow, every movement outside made Melissa's heart race. That night, as she lay in bed, trying to fall asleep, she couldn't stop thinking about the birds. She had seen their eyes, sharp and cold, and the way they had attacked without hesitation. It was as if they were hunting, and they had chosen her and Peyton as their prey. Peyton had nightmares that night, waking up screaming, his small body trembling with fear. Melissa held him close, whispering comforting words, but nothing could erase the images from his mind. It was going to be a long road ahead to help him overcome the trauma, but Melissa couldn't even focus on his pain without feeling her own. The fear was too deep. The next morning, Melissa called her husband, Kevin. He was on a business trip, and she didn't want to worry him at first. But now she needed him. She needed someone to talk to, someone who could make sense of all the chaos. Mel, what's going on? You sound different, Kevin asked, his voice full of concern. Kevin, we need to talk. Peyton and we were attacked by birds. I don't even know how to explain it, but a flock of wild birds, huge ones. They came after us in the park, she said, her voice shaking with the memories. For a moment, there was silence on the other end of the line. Kevin was clearly trying to process what she had said. What birds? Are you serious? What do you mean? He replied, disbelief in his voice. I don't know, Kevin. I don't know what happened. They attacked us. Peyton's leg is hurt, but he's okay physically, but mentally, I don't know how to help him. I don't know what to do, Kevin. I can't stop seeing their eyes, the way they looked at us. It was like they were hunting us. Melissa said, her voice breaking. On the other end of the line, Kevin was silent for a long moment. I'm coming home as soon as I can. Don't worry. Okay, we'll figure this out, he said finally. Melissa felt a small sense of relief hearing his voice, but it didn't fully chase away the fear. They were going to have to figure out what happened. But for now, all she wanted was to hold Peyton and make sure he knew he was safe. But that wasn't enough, not yet. The news that night was filled with reports of strange behavior in birds in the region. A few reports mentioned possible attacks, but it seemed like a minor issue compared to other stories. They didn't know the half of it. Melissa couldn't stop thinking about it. Something was wrong with these birds, something unnatural. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than anyone was saying. Chapter 4: The Consequences. Days passed, but the terror that Melissa and Peyton had experienced never left them. They were trying to return to their normal routine, but it was impossible to ignore the psychological effects of the attack. Peyton had become afraid of the outdoors, afraid of the sky, of the trees, of anything that resembled the birds that had come for them. At school, he refused to go outside for recess, and when asked about what had happened, he couldn't speak about it. Melissa tried to help him, but the memories of the birds' sharp talons and their cold, hungry eyes haunted him. He would wake up at night in a cold sweat, shaking in her arms. Melissa had gone to therapy sessions with Peyton, trying to help him cope with the trauma. The therapist explained that for children his age, Such an event could be deeply disturbing and require a lot of attention. They began special exercises, trying to rebuild Payne's sense of safety and security. But Melissa herself was still shaken. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the birds circling, waiting, hunting. She couldn't erase their image from her mind. The trauma was real, and it was affecting both of them. Melissa and Payne continued their sessions, and over time, they both began to heal. But it was clear that this experience had left a deep scar. Neither of them would be the same again. Chapter 1: A Normal Day. Lisa Taylor stood at the entrance of the park on the outskirts of Springfield, a small town in Missouri. She was holding a stroller with her 1-year-old son, Oscar. He's fully asleep inside. It was an ordinary, sunny day, just like any other. Lisa smiled as she watched the locals walking through the park, strolling with their dogs, and children playing on the swings. From time to time, she would stop to chat with her neighbors, but mostly, she preferred to spend time alone, enjoying the peace and greenery. That day, there was an unusual stillness in the air, broken only by the chirping of birds and the occasional voice of a passerby. However, Lisa couldn't predict that this day would become the most horrifying one of her life. As she was turning the stroller onto the path that led deeper into the park, her gaze lingered for a moment on the tall trees in the distance. Birds, which usually flew high in the sky, seemed strangely agitated, moving uneasily through the air. Lisa frowned, but quickly dismissed the thought. She had an important meeting. She was planning to meet her friend for tea at a cafe nearby, and she needed to hurry through this part of the park. Suddenly, right above her head, a sharp cry echoed, so loud that Lisa flinched. She looked up and saw a huge shadow flicker across the sky. The moment she turned to continue on her way, the stroller with Oscar became the center of a bizarre and terrifying event. Chapter 2: The Attack. The moment Lisa tried to turn and take a step forward, something happened that she couldn't even imagine in her worst nightmares. Out of nowhere, a flock of wild birds suddenly swooped down. Their beaks flashed with yellow eyes, and their wings beat with such force that the air itself seemed to tremble. These were large predatory birds, eagles and hawks, hunters that are rarely seen in such densely populated areas. Lisa instinctively rushed to the stroller, but at that moment, one of the birds struck her on the shoulder with its wing. She screamed in pain and surprise, but her gaze was fixed on Oscar. The baby, who had been sleeping, woke up, crying loudly from the noise. Lisa quickly grabbed his hands, trying to lift him, but at that moment, the birds began attacking the stroller. One of them, the largest, with bright golden feathers, soared into the air and almost unnoticed, swooped down towards the child, stretching its sharp talons toward him. Lisa, terrified, clutched him to her chest, but the bird did not stop. It struck the stroller, desperately trying to grab the baby. At that moment, Lisa felt panic and paralysis. Her body seemed to refuse to act, and she couldn't understand what was happening. Shame and anxiety mixed with the shock of this monstrous attack. Chapter 3: Fear and Despair. As Lisa shoved the stroller away, trying to lift Oscar, she was knocked to the ground. She fell, and at that moment, two more hawks landed nearby, almost touching her. Lisa felt their talons scraping through the air, but not against her body. She shut her eyes, feeling her pulse pounding in her temples. There was a sense that every breath was poisoned, and her mind was clouded by fear. Lisa screamed, but her voice drowned in the sounds of the wind, the birds' cries, and the noise, which seemed even louder than her own shouts. She felt her fingers beginning to lose their grip, and toys, bags, and her cell phone were falling off the stroller and onto the ground. Oscar continued crying, and Lisa, with no strength or understanding of what to do, simply held him and tried to shield him with her body. Then, From somewhere behind the trees, a roar was heard. People, several locals, hearing the screams, ran to help. One of the women, an elderly neighbor named Chloe, rushed over. Chapter 4: Help and Rescue. Chloe, who had been walking nearby, grabbed Lisa by the shoulder and, without hesitation, dragged her towards a nearby tree, trying to shield them from the attacking birds. "Hold on," Chloe shouted, despite her own fear. "We have to get to safety." But as soon as they moved away from the stroller, one of the birds headed straight for them. Lisa felt her heart stop, but Chloe didn't hesitate. She picked up a stone from the ground and threw it into the air, distracting the predator. The bird, momentarily distracted, screeched and flew off. The situation was critical, but at that moment, other people began to arrive, a few men and women from nearby benches, including a young man named Thomas, who had been parked in the lot nearby. He saw what was happening and rushed to the scene, immediately taking charge. Thomas was the kind of person who didn't hesitate in an emergency. He quickly surveyed the area and spotted a bench nearby where they could take cover. "Lisa, quick!" he shouted, running over to them. "Hide behind the bench. I'll help with the baby." Lisa, still shaken, followed him. Chloe, already close by, grabbed the stroller and hurried towards the bench, while the birds continued circling above the park, making low, threatening dives. One of them aimed straight at Oscar again, but Thomas swiftly pushed it away with a branch. "This is insane," he shouted, returning with a stone in hand, ready to defend them. Fortunately, the attack ceased, but the air was still filled with tension. The birds circled in the sky, casting angry glances down at the humans, as though waiting for an opportunity to strike again. Chapter 5: The Arrival of the Rescuers. Minutes later, police vehicles arrived at the park, their sirens blaring. Several cars with flashing lights stopped at the entrance, and officers quickly disembarked. They immediately began to survey the area, setting up their equipment to ensure safety. Soon after, wildlife control officers and veterinarians joined them. "We received several reports of bird attacks. What's going on here?" one of the officers asked as he approached the group. Chloe, who remained the calmest, explained the situation. These were eagles and hawks. They literally attacked people. They almost grabbed the baby." One of the wildlife control officers, Jason, looked concerned. He examined the birds, which hadn't flown far, and cast a worried glance at the frightened people. "This is highly unusual," Jason said. "Normally, these birds don't attack humans, especially not in such densely populated areas. It seems they've lost their natural fear and turned aggressive." The police and wildlife experts quickly began organizing evacuations from the park. They set up protective nets to shield the area from further attacks and cordon off the territory. Meanwhile, Lisa and Oscar sat on the bench, still in shock from what had happened. She held her son tightly in her arms, and although his cries had quieted, Lisa's face remained pale with fear and exhaustion. "Are we safe?" she whispered to Chloe. "Yes, you're safe," Chloe replied, hugging her. "You made it, Lisa. You did great." But Lisa's anxiety didn't subside. What had caused these predators to come after people? Why had they become so aggressive? A million questions raced through her mind, but there were no answers. Chapter 6: Investigation and Aftermath. In the following days, the situation in Springfield remained under control, but the aftermath of the bird attacks was still felt throughout the town. Police and wildlife specialists launched an investigation to determine the cause. Some suggested that the attack was related to changes in the local ecosystem. Recently, there had been active logging in the area, which could have disrupted the birds' natural habitat and forced them to seek out new sources of food. While no clear answer was found, The residents of the town continued to live in constant tension. Lisa and her family, like many others, began avoiding walks in the park, fearing another attack. Oscar, though physically unharmed, still occasionally woke up crying in the middle of the night, reminding his mother of what had happened. Lisa found herself increasingly wondering what they could have done to prevent the attack and how they might regain trust in simple, safe outdoor walks. Though the predatory bird's aggression eventually began to subside, the concern for wildlife preservation and human safety became a pressing issue for the entire town, and the event quickly became the subject of many conversations and debates.